Hello everyone, I welcome all of you in this introductory lecture on subject called International Relations. This would be a lecture series and this would be the first lecture in that lecture series, which we call it Introductory Lecture. I would talk about what all things we are going to discuss in this lecture. I would also talk about what all lectures are coming your way as part of this entire lecture series, right? So first of all, let me talk about the entire scheme of this lecture series, right? These are the topics that we would be covering. Today's lecture would be this one, introductory lecture. I would talk about what all things we are going to cover in the next slide. This would be second lecture, overview of international relations, very much important because many a times we talk about different bilateral case studies, we talk about international organizations, we talk about different agreements, international agreements. However, we do not understand the context in which all these things are happening, right? So this lecture would define the context, which has got a basis of world history, modern world history. We will be talking about certain events of modern world history which define the context of international relations. So that will be a topic in the next lecture, overview of international relations. The third topic would be basic concepts. Again, very important. Generally, we do not pay much attention to this topic, but this has been something which has been accepted as a background by any person who is writing an article on international relations. We generally tend to read articles from Indian Express, Hindu and other different sources, but different concepts which are being used in order to explain something, say India-Sri Lanka relations for that matter, India-China relations. So those concepts we don't understand, then we don't understand the entire article as such or that case study. And that is why it is very pertinent, important, relevant to understand the basic concepts. So we'll be covering basic concepts just in the sense that a student of general studies would be able to understand different articles which appear in newspapers. Next topic would be similarly political ideologies and approaches to IR. Many scholars write articles in which they use different terms like liberal policies, neoliberal policies, socialist policies. So we should have some idea regarding political ideologies and then approaches to IR. That means there are different approaches which shed light on different dimensions of international relations. So there is one approach called realist approach, other approach is liberal approach, third is the Marxist approach, feminist approach, right? There are different approaches to international relations, environmental approach for that matter, which shed light on different dimensions of international relations, which is very important to understand what is coming next, right? So these four topics to begin with, I would say this is foundational content based on which we would be able to understand the next content which reflects UPSC syllabus, right? So this is where you may get that feel that we are discussing something relevant to UPSC examination, but this is hidden part that you are supposed to prepare, right? If you don't do this, understanding of this part would be incomplete, and that is why we would spend 4 to 5 lectures on basic concepts which are very important, relevant to understand these things. For example, suppose we discuss environmental degradation as a global issue, global concern, right? We should also have some understanding of environmental approach to international relations, right? So that is how these lectures are very important. Then we would talk about global issues, relevant global issues, international terrorism, there would be one lecture on that, globalization, right? Environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation. So this lecture would again create a background because any country, including India, have their policies on all these topics. So for example, India has got a particular policy on what is called nuclear proliferation, right? So the issue of nuclear proliferation, why didn't we sign NPT, non-proliferation treaty, right? Why we do not really sign the ongoing discussions on CTBT, right? Why don't we think of signing it? So there is a definite policy of India which is called nuclear policy that we are supposed to discuss going forward, but we should know the problem of nuclear proliferation first, right? We will talk about that as well. Now here comes the actual syllabus of UPSC, which is there in the GS paper 2, right? It's a 4-line syllabus based on which I have picked up some topics so that we cover as much as possible as far as this topic is concerned in GS paper 2. First topic, overview of foreign policy of India. Now the question is, why do we need this? Many a times you may tend to think that the questions which appear in the UPSC examination are current based, but number of times those questions want you to relate to the older policies of India, right? There were questions on change in India's policy on environment, for example, right? So in that sense, or for that matter, how neighborhood first policy of India changed over a number of years since independence, right? You should at least have some idea regarding India's foreign policy, so to say, from first Prime Minister to the current Prime Minister, from Nehru to Modi, right? So we would talk about those differences, similarities in policies, right? Right from the first Prime Minister up to the present Prime Minister. Then these case studies is another topic. India and neighborhood, we would cover all case studies. So all the neighboring countries of India, say Pakistan, say Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, China, Maldives, Sri Lanka, right? Afghanistan, for that matter, Bangladesh. We would discuss each and every case study, and we would discuss from the beginning, that is independence, right? Since then up to present times, we would connect it to the current affairs, right? Then we would talk about Indian global powers. Say for example, India, US, India, China, India, Russia, and likewise. We would talk about India and regional organizations. We may discuss a couple of case studies, India and ASEAN, India and EU, because ASEAN and EU happen to be the most successful experiments of what are called regional organizations, right? There would be a couple of lectures on this. We would talk about UNO as an important organization, right? And then important current issues. Based on this content, you may feel prima facie that we are missing something from the syllabus. It's not like that. So for example, you may feel that I haven't discussed WTO, right? I haven't discussed, say for example, UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, right? All those things would be covered here. The discussion up to this point, there would be discussion on different things. For example, globalization. Don't you think before we talk about globalization, we have to talk about Bretton Woods institutions and how Bretton Woods institutions laid the ground, laid the foundation, created the environment for globalization to flourish. So it is not that different organizations are not covered. In this discussion, a lot of things will be covered which are part of what is called UPSC syllabus for international relations. Let us now talk about, in this lecture, which is introductory lecture, right? We will talk about different topics. First, we will talk about what is the meaning, purpose, and scope of international relations. Before we talk about India's foreign policy, we need to understand the subject. That is point one. Point two, we will talk about UPSC syllabus for IR. International relations as a subject is a huge subject, right? What is expected as far as the UPSC examination is concerned, that is defined by the syllabus. We will discuss the syllabus. We will talk about sample questions on IR, right, from the previous year question papers, right? We will talk about how to study IR, what should be your approach to this subject, and at the end of it, we will talk about sources for the study of IR. So from what books, from what sources we are supposed to generate the content in order to write effective answers in the mains examination. So let us talk about the first topic, IR, meaning, purpose, and scope. And please understand, what we are discussing right now is very much important in order to understand the content according to syllabus, right? There are some simple questions here in order to make you understand what do we understand by the term international relations. In fact, the first question, what do we understand by international relations, can be broken up into different parts. It can be broken up into different parts. So inter, national, and relations. Just forget this part for a moment. Let us focus on this part. So we get into relations as an individual. Likewise, nation states also get into relations with other nation states, right? So when we talk about relations of individuals, I'm talking about individuals currently, right? Human beings for that matter, human relations. There is a question. Why human beings get into relations, right? There's a simple answer to this question. What is it? The relations are because of needs and interests. Human beings get into relations because of needs and interest, right? One may say that I have a selfless kind of relationship because I am emotionally attached to a person, right? But the point is, emotional needs are also needs. right? There is no relation which is not based on needs or interest. So in short, all the relations are based on needs and interest. What we are supposed to do now, just replace an individual or human being by what is called nation, or to be more precise, nation state, right? So international relations are nothing but the relation between different nation states. Likewise, ये जो हमने discuss किया, what we discussed here, कि why human relations exist because of needs and interest, right? Then the similar question can be asked, why do relations exist between different nation states? That is because every nation has got needs, every nation has got certain interests, because of which they get into relations, right? And needs and interests of a nation is called national interest. Very simple and precise, right? So because of national interest, nation states get into a relationship. Now the point is, this is fair enough. The next point is, what is nation and what is nation state, right? Let us try to understand that briefly. When we talk about this term, nation, right? We have to understand that this is a sentimental concept. Nation is a sentimental concept. I'm talking about modern understanding of nation, right? There is an older definition as well, which is called cultural nationalism these days. The older definition is a group of people having common culture, common past, common language, common heritage. That group of people is called nation. But this definition is invalid today because due to globalization, right? Every nation is today multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural in nature. And India has been so since ancient times, right? So a simple understanding of nation today, modern one, is doesn't matter what kind of background do they have in terms of history, in terms of culture, in terms of language. A group of people having oneness, having that feeling of oneness is called nation. That group of people having oneness is called nation. And that feeling of oneness is a feeling. And that is why I said it is sentimental concept. I hope everybody understands this. So nation is a sentimental concept, group of people having feeling of oneness. Let me give an example. So now today, Rishi Sunak, who happens to be Prime Minister of Britain, right, considers himself as a British citizen. Whereas his roots are Indian, right? His background is Indian, his culture is Indian, right? So despite having a different background, different history, different culture, different language, he is part of what is called British nationalism. So today, that definition of cultural nationalism does not hold good considering the globalized world. So that is why nation is defined in this manner. A group of people having feeling of oneness. Now, is it that nation is the basic unit of international relations? I am asking another question here. Is nation basic unit of international relations? The answer is no in a way, right? What is basic unit, by the way? Society that we live in has got a basic unit. What is that? Individual, human being is the basic unit, right? So likewise, international society, the basic unit of international society happens to be nation state and not nation as such. So that brings us to another question. What is the difference between nation and nation state, right? We talked about what is nation. Now let us try and understand what is this term nation state, right? Now this term is made up of two terms. One is nation, other is state. And we have already talked about what is nation. Now let us talk about what is state. As I said, nation is sentimental concept, state is territorial concept. State is territorial concept in the sense, what is state? In simple manner, definition. A group of people living on a defined territory with a sovereign government. That means there's a defined territory, people live on the territory and they have got a sovereign government, right? That brings us to another concept, that is sovereignty. Yeah, for sovereign, right? What is sovereign? Again, simple understanding. Highest authority is called sovereign. That means there is no other authority above what is called sovereign, right? So sovereignty rather is an important feature of state, as a concept, right? When group of people having oneness live on a defined territorial space with a sovereign government, that is called nation state. I hope you understand this. Now the point is, we talked about nation state as a composite term, having that term nation as well as state inside. We associated the concept of state with what is called sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty has got two dimensions: internal sovereignty and external sovereignty. What do we mean by this? Internal sovereignty means in the defined territory, right? The state is the highest authority. There is no other authority dictating terms to state. That is called internal sovereignty. Now, as I said, there is something called international society made up of nation states, right? When other nation states give you recognition as a sovereign state, that is called external dimension of sovereignty, right? So external dimension of sovereignty I explained in a verbal manner. Let us take an example that will be more clear to you. There are two nations. One is Palestine right now, which is in current affairs, and other is Israel. Right? Now Israel can be called as nation state because it has got recognition, right? There is a body in the world today, right, where every nation state seeks membership. That is called UNO. The moment you get UNO's membership, you get that status of nation state, you get external sovereignty. That means acceptance, recognition on the part of other nations for your sovereignty, right? That is called external dimension of sovereignty. Whereas Palestine does not have that external dimension. That is why at the most Palestine can be called as nation and not nation state. It does not enjoy the external sovereignty, right? Because even membership is not been given to Palestine yet, right? I hope this makes it very clear. Coming back to the three questions, the simple answers, something that we discussed. Let's get those answers quickly. So there are three questions. What do we understand by IR? What is the meaning of nation? What is the meaning of nation state? So this is the basic understanding in front of you, right? The literal meaning of IR is relations between nation states. Literal meaning. Word to word meaning jo bolte na, right? So literal meaning is relations between nation states, something that we discussed, right? Nation is sentimental concept as I explained, right? People having feeling of oneness. Nation state, on the other hand, is a nation with a sovereign government recognized by community of nations. Other nation states are supposed to recognize you, right? Now the point is, while writing this, I said community of nations. I did not say community of nation states, right? That is because every time you cannot use that full term, nation state. Hence, for all practical purposes, any kind of literature that you read for IR, any kind of book, any kind of newspaper article that you read, whenever that article, newspaper, book mentions the word nation, it practically means nation state, right? Is that clear? So even if we are referring to nation somewhere in international relations article or book or something like that, it essentially means nation state. Technically speaking, that is different between nation and nation state. So it is nation state that happens to be basic unit of international relations. What is the purpose of international relations? We talked about meaning in a short manner. Let us talk about the purpose of international relations. Why do we need to study IR as such, right? International relations as a subject gives general education to diplomats, which they use in their practical life. Nation states build relations, they negotiate with each other, they talk to each other, generally through diplomats, right? Official channel is diplomacy, diplomats. They also engage in talks through their leaders, political leaders. So you talk about diplomats, you talk about political leaders, they need to have some understanding of international relations. So international relations as a subject gives understanding to these people who use it practically. That is the first important function or purpose of international relations as a subject. Second, human survival and progress. Again, this is a big topic. I would talk more about this in the next lecture, but just to make things clear here, when we say human survival and progress, there are two terms used here. First is survival, other is progress. And we need to use in that sequence only because progress is possible only when you survive. The first requirement is survival. Then the natural question is as to why survival has become so important. There's a simple reason for that. World War I happened in the time period 1914 to 1919, almost 1918 you can say. So during this time, if you stop here, say if I stop in 1920 and look back on the entire human history, this happens to be the most devastating war in the entire human history. The kind of destruction that was seen during World War I was unprecedented, right? The entire world went into a shock, and world leaders started thinking about preventing such wars in future, right? In order to prevent something from happening, you first need to find the cause behind it, right? And when you talk about conflict and you want to avoid the conflict in the future, the first question is conflict that you're trying to avoid, who are the actors involved in it? In this conflict, the actors involved were nation states, right? So different nation states, they fought with each other, right? So one nation state, other nation state. Say for example, UK, Great Britain, and you talk about Germany. If suppose we study relations of these two countries before World War I and try to understand what are those points which are leading them to a conflict. If we study it beforehand and if we can minimize those points, we can avoid the war. This kind of feeling came into different scholars, and they started taking this study of IR seriously. What does that mean? It means international relations as a subject was never an independent subject. It was part and parcel of what is called political science in general, right? For the first time after World War I, international relations became a separate subject. That is where it became significant, because these were devastating wars, World War I, World War II, right? And that is why one important purpose when this subject became an independent subject was human survival and progress, right? Number 3, see, doesn't matter how best efforts we put in, right? There are certain conflicts which are protracted. What do we understand by protracted conflict? A conflict that goes on for number of years, number of decades. So for example, we have been talking about Israel-Palestine conflict ever since that partition happened in 1948. So 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s, more than 7 decades, right? We have been talking about what is called Israel-Palestine conflict. There are certain conflicts which go on for a long duration of time. There are certain conflicts which get resolved. There are certain conflicts which are not resolved, can be controlled, if we have a sound understanding of this subject, right? So this subject makes us understand the conflicts, problems, international problems. It enables us to resolve them many a times. We can resolve the conflicts. And sometimes when the conflict is not resolved, or so to say, if not resolution, then conflict management can be done based on understanding of IR, right? So what is conflict management? Controlling the problems in such a manner, that the negative impacts are minimized. So whenever Israel-Palestine conflict is not active the way we are seeing today, there's a war going on in Gaza Strip, right? When war is not happening, there is some kind of understanding that is called conflict is being managed. The negative impacts are reduced. That is called conflict management. So third purpose is understanding, resolving, and controlling international problems, right? So these are purposes of international relations, right, as a subject. Now, let us talk about the third dimension, that is scope of this subject. Scope of IR. See, we have to understand that this is one subject that requires a lot of preparation and hardly 4 questions appear in the mains examination, right? So that looks quite disproportionate. However, with right kind of understanding of the subject, we can make it manageable. We can read minimum content which is required, minimum in the sense which is optimally required, right? Without going into the vastness of this subject. But before we minimize it, let us try and understand the scope. Then we will talk about how to minimize it. This scope is ever expanding in the sense international relations are impacted by a lot of factors: political, social, economic, cultural, right? New subjects come in. So international terrorism is something that we see since, say, 1950s, 60s, 70s onwards. For that matter, you talk about cyber warfare. Nobody would have thought about cyber warfare in, say, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. That cyber world is a new phenomenon, right? But that becomes part of international relations. So as and when new topics come in, as and when new actors come in, the scope goes on increasing, right? So that is why we have written here, the scope of IR is ever expanding, right? Traditionally speaking, when that subject evolved as an independent subject since World War I, traditionally speaking, it was relations between nation states. That is what I was discussing while discussing the meaning of this subject, right? The relation between nation states, right? Which is called state system. Which is called state system, right? Now this state system is called Westphalian in nature. It is called Westphalian state system. I will talk about what is Westphalian state system briefly, and in the next lecture, that is overview of IR, we will talk in detail about this. Westphalia is a region in Germany, right? It's a province in Germany, wherein people came together, world leaders came together and decided to end the wars, right? 30 years war, 80 years war in Europe. And ultimately from Westphalian Treaty, right, the concept of nation state came, right? And that is why it is called Westphalian system, right? So international relations, traditionally speaking, is essentially study of state system, or in simpler words, it is a study of the relation between different nation states. But in modern times, as we have mentioned right in the beginning, it is ever expanding kind of a scope. In modern times, the scope has increased. So modern IR includes a relation between nation states, that is international politics, so to say. The traditional IR is called international politics, right? So that part is there in the modern. Additional thing is, there are international regional organizations, international law, geopolitics, alliances, groupings, global issues. So this has expanded the scope of IR, right? To put it simply for your understanding, right? We'll go to the next slide that would summarize the thing that I'm talking about in a simple manner. International relations can be divided into two parts, right? Something what is called IP, international politics, which is a narrow kind of a subject matter in which we study official relations between nation states only, right? Then new actors came in, particularly in the second half of 20th century. New issues arised in second half of 20th century, and then we include different international organizations, regional organizations, global issues like terrorism, I am saying, etc. here. The list goes on, right? This is how we look at international relations. Again, to make it more simple, I can use the Venn diagram. This is how you can show the relation between international politics and international relations, right? International relations is a wider subject, and international politics is subset of it. It is subset of what is called international relations. And when we say new actors, UNO was formed in 1945. Bretton Woods institutions as well, World Bank, IMF, right? And number of other organizations came in, IAEA, for example, 1948. So in the second half of 20th century, you see number of new actors coming up, right? In 1968, ASEAN was formed, right? In 1957, EEC was formed, European Economic Community, right? And likewise, in 1885, SAARC was formed. So in second half of 20th century, number of new international organizations, number of new regional organizations came up. So conventionally, international relations, which was studying the relation of one nation, say, with other nation, now has to also study relation of a nation with an international organization, relation of a nation with a regional organization, and so on. And even global issues for that matter. The issue of environment, issue of human rights, UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is of 1948, right? Then there are international covenants on human rights in 1967. So human rights as a global concern, environment as a global concern, international terrorism is a global concern. We know 1945 is the year in which we saw the experiment of the devastating experiment of unfortunate experiment of nuclear weapons. So nuclear proliferation, all these topics came in the second half of 20th century where the scope of IR increased considerably, and that is why it becomes a wider subject as compared to what is called IP, which was sort of a narrow subject. Let us move to the very relevant topic for us, that is UPSC syllabus for international relations. Let us quickly go through it. Strictly speaking, international relations in strict sense of the term is not a topic for preliminary examination, right? Let us try to understand this. Preliminary examination would not have questions like analyze the relation between India and any other country. However, it would have one component which has been explicitly mentioned. Current events of international importance. What would come here? Different important international events, right? Geography related to it. Golan Heights के ऊपर सवाल आया था एक बार, right? Geographical aspects, right? It would talk about certain agreements for that matter. Important policies of different EU के policy के ऊपर आया था, data policy के ऊपर. There was a question, right, in preliminary examination. So these kind of aspects would be asked in current events, right? As far as preliminary examination is concerned, but there is nothing like analysis of different relation between nation states, right? So IR is that way speaking is main specific topic, right? As far as mains examination is concerned, the syllabus can be found in GS paper 2, right? And in GS paper 2, there are 4 lines of syllabus, and there are 4 questions which are asked. In last few years, before that there were more questions, and even the format was different, right? So first line of syllabus clearly says India and neighborhood. So what is India's neighborhood? India and neighborhood relations. So India's neighborhood is South Asia. So all those countries in South Asia can be called as neighbors of India, right? With whom India shares either territorial boundary or maritime boundary. So China is our neighbor, Nepal is our neighbor, Bhutan is our neighbor, Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka are maritime neighbors, right? Pakistan is our neighbor, Afghanistan is our neighbor, Myanmar is our neighbor, right? Indian neighborhood relations. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we would discuss all the case studies, right? Then second topic, bilateral, regional, global groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interest. Now let's read this line of syllabus in a different manner. If I stop the syllabus here itself, this becomes unending subject. There are numerous bilateral, regional, global groupings. Numerous global groupings exist. There are a number of agreements, right? It becomes unmanageable kind of syllabus, right? But what limits our syllabus, our scope is the second part, involving India and or affecting India's interest. You have to be very clear while reading something. If something has happened which is not even remotely connected to India, do not read. If something has happened which has got some kind of impact on India, do read. Whether it is an agreement, whether it is a global grouping, whether it is an organization like UNO, whether it is an organization like WTO, right? So all those things you would read in terms of agreements and groupings which have got some kind of involvement of India or in any way they are impacting India's interest. The subject line number 2. Number 3, effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries. Again, the same kind of suffix has been attached here on India's interest and Indian diaspora. Any kind of policy and politics impacting Indian interest and Indian diaspora. So Ukraine war that we are talking about becomes important from India, particularly from this perspective, because our relations with Ukraine have been limited. And in comparison, our relations with Russia have been very deep kind of relations, right? And that is why Western countries criticize India's policy as ambivalent policy, right? Which doesn't take any kind of clear-cut stand, right? That is because Russia is important for us from numerous perspectives. We would talk about that in the case study, right? So Indian diaspora is an important reason why Ukraine war becomes important for us. You talk about politics as such. I'm taking one example at a time. So the politics, say, between developed countries versus developing countries on the question of environment, right, or climate change. Now, India is part of what is called developing countries, and India's policies and policies of developing countries, they are same. And that is why India takes a stand which is in sync with these countries. So I'll give you a latest example. Recently, we had a presidency of G20 group of countries, right? In that G20 group of countries, in our presidency, we made it very clear that we would voice the concerns of Global South. And Global South is nothing but developed and underdeveloped countries. So this is a politics going on between developed countries and developing countries. When I would take up that topic called environmental degradation as a global concern, something that I mentioned in the first slide as part of this entire lecture series, we would definitely talk about the politics between developed countries and developing countries on the question of, say, environment. And different other topics are there where you see that politics. And this lecture series will definitely cover that aspect as well. Number 4, important international institutions, agencies, and fora, their structure and mandate. Now here, you don't need to add that suffix, which is this one, involving India, impacting India's interest and all that, because most of the important foras, most of the important organizations, India is part of already, right? Where India is not part, say like NPT, that also needs to be discussed, because India being a nuclear power, why India is not part of NPT? That becomes an important topic again. So in that sense, all the important organizations, international organizations, agencies, what is fora? Fora is nothing but forums. The word forum is singular word. Plural can be forums as well as fora, different forums, right? For example, Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited South Pacific Island countries, and we created a forum for dialogue between India and South Pacific Island countries. These are called forums, right? So those are to be studied. Now, this becomes a vast topic again, as far as syllabus is concerned. How to limit it? Here you can bring that topic. What one? Which one? Current affairs is something that would limit this topic. That means we would study those institutions, those agencies, those fora which are in current affairs in last 1.5 years. That is how you can limit the syllabus. But this is 4 lines of syllabus. In fact, I would tell you, UPSC has tried to cover almost entire world. That makes it a very big topic. But again, if we understand one thing, if you understand one thing clearly, this topic becomes easy. General perception is this topic requires a lot of preparation and only 4 questions come. That is true, no doubt about that. But we can minimize our efforts and make it more profitable kind of ratio, which is called, cost-benefit ratio, by understanding one proverb. What is that? It is better to learn the art of fishing than asking for the fish. You may go on listening number of lectures online. You may go on listening to number of case studies online. But can you learn something like, if I understand this subject, can I understand the relationship based on my own reading? Can I be independent somewhere after a particular course? Can I get that art of fishing? Right? So that is my objective in this lecture series. The objective is not to cover everything. That is not possible, right? Because it is ongoing kind of subject. You may require n number of lectures for that. The objective is to enable you through the discussion, right? To make you ready through discussion to understand international relations, India's foreign policy on your own. That is what I intend through this lecture series, right? And that would make it a very easy kind of a task for you. Now, having discussed syllabus, let us now talk about some sample questions. So this is one question from preliminary examination, the nature of which I have already talked about. These are based on certain events or some kind of location. You can see it here, refugees and location. Let us see when you are a beginner and you want to look at the previous year questions, previous year question papers, do not try to answer them because you are not yet prepared. If you fail to answer them, general tendency is to self-victimize. I am not good for this examination, right? Don't do it. Do not answer. Don't even look at the details. Just try to understand nature of the question. कुछ location दिए हुए हैं. There are some locations given, right? वो कहाँ पे पूछा है? So geographical aspect of certain important events, refugees का event है, conflict का event है, अफ्रीका में, केनिया, सुदान, सोमालिया, right? So you need to keep an eye on what is happening in the world, significantly speaking, which involves some kind of global concern. Like if you talk about refugees, refugees के अपने rights होते हैं, human rights. So human rights is a global concern. So likewise, you have to keep an eye on events which are linked to either global concerns, which are linked to India, India's interest, Indian diaspora, important international institutions, according to syllabus, right? You can keep in mind these kind of things. I have picked up another question from the examination of 2022. You can see it here. So again, very clearly, region is mentioned here. Region, and what has been seen, what has been stated here, mentioned in the recent news, and the country. Match the following kind of question, pairs. So this is the nature of preliminary questions, which does not come in the category of international relations as such. It comes in the category of what is called current events of international importance, right? Now let us talk about the questions from mains, because that is more important for us. The subject of international relations is part of mains primarily. So mains examination 2022, let us look at those 4 questions. These first two questions are 10 markers. India is age-old friend. See what has been written. India is age-old friend of Sri Lanka. Now this is quote unquote. This is quote unquote. Discuss India's role in recent crisis in Sri Lanka in the light of the preceding statement. So one thing is very clear. The preceding statement should be your guiding light in order to write the answer. So आपका जो content है, the content that would come from the different articles, that content must be given a flavor. Which flavor? India's age-old relations. And that is why I said it is important to study a case study like India-Sri Lanka relations ka case study. It has to be studied since independence up to present times. And when we begin understanding India-Sri Lanka relations, there would be a reference to India's ancient relations as well. And Buddhism has played an important role in the relation between these two countries, right? Second question, don't answer the question, just try to understand the nature of the questions based on a discussion that we had in last, say, 20-30 minutes. Do you think that BIMSTEC is a parallel organization like SAARC? What are similarities and dissimilarities between two? How are Indian foreign policy objectives realized by forming this new organization? Let me tell you an important thing. SAARC is dysfunctional today. It is not working. Primarily because of Pakistan's obstructionist attitude. There were different other reasons as well. SAARC is dysfunctional. वो काम नहीं कर रहा है. And that is why India needed another organization, similar organization, if not same organization, to deal with problems in South Asia particularly, which happens to be our neighborhood. So BIMSTEC provides that alternative. But having said that, the similarity ends there because BIMSTEC contains certain nations and excludes certain nations of SAARC. So BIMSTEC cannot be called as exact replica of SAARC, right? And there are numerous issues which haunt South Asia, which originate from say Pakistan, say Afghanistan, which are not part of BIMSTEC. So you won't be able to solve those problems which arise out of that region, Pakistan, Afghanistan, using BIMSTEC. I'm giving you some hints as to how you are supposed to write this question, because there are 3 questions, right? First question is, do you think that BIMSTEC is parallel organization like SAARC? Your answer should be to some extent, not completely. Second, what similarities and dissimilarities can be seen? You can talk about that. Then, India's foreign policy objectives जो meet होंगे through BIMSTEC is something that you are supposed to write. Let us talk about the next 2 questions, which are 20 markers. Generally in GS paper 2, question number 9 and 10 are 10 markers on IR, and question number 19 and 20 are 20 markers on IR, right? Let's look at those, 15 markers, I beg your pardon. So 15 marker here. How will I2, U2, right? So India, Israel, I2. U2, UAE and USA, grouping transform India's position in global politics. Imagine this, huh? And that is why the second lecture that I mentioned, that is overview of international relations, is very important. Many a times, initial lectures that I conduct, people don't take it seriously, students many a times, but they realize that very late. That forms the background. In the overview of international relations, I would talk about how international relations have evolved since World War I, World War II, post World War, the Cold War ka era hai, post Cold War period, in the decade of 1990s, in the decade of 2000s, in the decade of 2010s, 20s, what kind of global politics is unfolding. That is very important because wo context sawal mein aa gaya na. In the current global politics, how do you look at I2U2? And how would it transform India's position in that global politics? And that is why it is important to understand the global politics itself. That would be topic of our next lecture for that matter, right? So I2U2 has already been called Western Quad or West Asian Quad rather. इसको क्या बोला गया है? West Asian Quad. And we know Quad. What is Quad? That quadrilateral security dialogue between India, US, Australia and Japan. This is called West Asian Quad, right? Next question. Clear energy is the order of the day. Describe briefly India's changing policy towards climate change in various international fora in the context of geopolitics. Now, again, this is not a very simple kind of question. First of all, you talk about the context of geopolitics. While discussing syllabus, I mentioned that conflict between global north and global south, and when I'm saying conflict here, it is political conflict, right? So at politics between global north and global south, us context mein, in that context, you are supposed to talk about clear energy being order of the day. And in that sense, what has been India's changing policy, right? I would give you one example just to get some idea about it, right? India's policy has transformed, not changed. Try to understand this. So far, India has been playing a role of what? Leader of global south, and India's policies are aligned in that manner. In the last slide, I was talking about this. But recently, particularly under Prime Minister Modi, India is emerging slowly as global climate leader, not just leader of global south, as a global climate leader. That is one important change you must pinpoint in this answer, right? So in short, what we discussed based on these 4 questions from GS Mains 2022, we clearly understand it requires an understanding going beyond mere understanding of the relation between two nation states. दो देशों के बीच का relation पढ़ लिया, बात खत्म. It's not like that. You have to understand the global context, global politics, which form the backdrop for many issues, relation between different nation states, agreements. तो सारा जो syllabus है, it has to be understood in a context, and that is global politics. That's why the study and approach should be a bit different as compared to the conventional approach that we have been following. That needs some change now. Now, let us come to the last part of this entire lecture. How to study IR. In fact, in the entire lecture, we have been talking about this, right? But I summarize that now. First of all, as I said in the beginning, understand the basic concepts, very important. Unless you understand basic concepts, you don't understand anything else, right? Then understand development of IR so far, because there were a number of questions which come in this manner in the context of global politics or geopolitics, right? So that means you need to understand how IR has developed, how global politics has evolved. Number 3, study foreign policy of India since independence. That question on Sri Lanka clearly tells us age-old relationship hai, obviously formalized हुआ 1947 onwards, but उस context में आपको recent crisis में the kind of role India is playing, that has to be studied. So this is important. Then focus on current affairs, obvious part that everybody talks about. Very few talk about this part. Everybody talks about this one. That is known thing, right? The questions come from the current affairs, right? With syllabus points in mind. Do not read everything. Syllabus makes it very clear. You are supposed to talk about, study those agreements, those organizations in which India is involved and or. it is impacting India's interest, right? Read articles from both newspapers, Indian Express and The Hindu. I have a general tendency to say it like this: Indian Express is equal to international relations. Do not take it very literally, but the crux should be taken. If you read Indian Express for the last 1.5 years before mains examination, I'm telling you, you're almost good to go for dealing with those four or whatever number of questions come in international relations. That does not mean you would exclude articles from The Hindu. If you read these two sources very carefully, you can get hold of syllabus of IR and you can answer those questions. Anything else required can be part of enrichment. You can reach out to me at any point of time. We can talk about more resources and more sources for the study of international relations. At the end of this lecture, let me quickly talk about the sources which are required. Keep it simple. There are only 4 questions. It's a small topic which requires a lot of preparation, right? So read NCERT books, and in that particularly, I would suggest 2 books. One is World History, that would prepare you for evolving global politics. इसके context में कई सारे सवाल आए हैं, तो read this carefully. I would link World History to IR in the next lecture, right? Then you read Contemporary World Politics. This is directly linked to international politics, or what is called IR. These 2 NCERTs are very important for us. You read all NCERTs, but these 2 are important. All क्यों पढ़ना है? Because if you read economics के NCERTs, then only you are able to understand globalization, which is an important topic in IR. You read class study material carefully for basic concepts. We would provide that, right? And read current affairs material. The primary source I talked about, Indian Express and The Hindu. This is more than sufficient. As I said short while ago, any kind of enrichment, having done this, then we can talk about additional kind of resources, right? That's it from my side. This is what I wanted to discuss with all of you as part of the introductory lecture of International Relations lecture series. Thank you so much.